everyone, welcome to Salt City Euros. My name is Nico, this is my buddy Matt. And today we're going to be converting this E30 from an automatic to a manual transmission. Shooting the intro, we realized we're gonna have to take the car back out to get it completely unloaded because we want to lay out all the parts for you guys to see what it takes to do a manual swap. Because hi. Well, we got our third member right here. Are you gonna help us? You gonna help us convert the car? Or are you just gonna run in front of the camera the whole time? But yeah, so as I was saying, we're gonna have to take the car back out, unload the car, lay out all the parts, explain what each part does, because some of you might not necessarily understand exactly what the difference between an automatic and a manual setup in a car is. So we're gonna walk everybody through that. Little disclaimer, as always, not a certified mechanic, just doing this for fun, and just wanna make sure you guys understand that you do everything at your own risk. And basically, I just wanna make sure you guys stay safe when you're wrenching. Just take this for entertainment purposes only. Alright. Squats. We got a single mass flywheel that has not yet been resurfaced, so that's something that he should probably get done. You can see the heat marks. So we got everything laid out for you guys. Just remember, this may very well differ for your application. There's a lot of differences between early and late model vehicles. So again, this is just a general idea of what's going on with a manual setup, or a standard as they call it in some parts of the world. So first things first, of course, we have the main component, which is the transmission. This can be a 5-speed, a 6-speed. And depending on that, there will be variances in the drive shaft and the clutch setup and the shifter linkage that you'll be using. In order to get the power from the engine, you first have a so-called flywheel. Now, these come in dual mass applications or single mass, as you saw us unpack from the car. Rob actually ended up deciding to go with a dual mass setup, but just for reference, you can see this is a single mass flywheel and this is a dual mass flywheel. I'm not gonna spend any time explaining the exact differences, but it's basically just one is sportier and one is a little bit more comfortable for daily driving. So he's going with a dual mass setup, and you bolt the flywheel to the crankshaft, so at the back of your engine. And this is gonna be spinning all the time with the engine. And in order to transfer the power from the engine to the transmission, you have a clutch plate, which is right here. This sits in the flywheel. Then you have a so-called pressure plate, which bolts to this assembly. And this whole assembly now is spinning with the engine. And there is a mechanism that the transmission uses, which is your clutch setup, your clutch pedal, your slave cylinder, master slave cylinder, that make the clutch engage and disengage inside of this assembly. And that's what gives the car the ability to move forward or backward, depending on if you're obviously in first or reverse gear. The whole thing transfers power to this shaft of the transmission. I don't know if you can see that on the camera, but okay, so then you have your clutch plate that slides onto the transmission shaft right there on the spline. And I don't know if this makes any sense, but basically these two are spinning at the speed of the engine, and this one is just idling. This one should not be spinning. However, when you press the clutch pedal, this gets engaged and transfers the power into your transmission and then puts it out to the back wheels. So now we have a couple very important, sorry, pardon my dirty, oily fingers, but we got a couple of components that are very important for a manual car. This is called a pilot bearing. This actually sits on the end here, and helps stabilize the whole assembly. This actually gets pressed into the back of the crank. You'll see that later, the crankshaft. And then the transmission gets slid in like that. And it helps it just run smoother, and when this thing is going out, you can hear like a grinding noise when your clutch is getting engaged and disengaged. So that means your pilot bearing is bad. Okay, another couple of components that are vital in order for this whole thing to work is you have a so-called clutch pivot fork. That's what it's called. And it sits right in here. And then you have a throwout bearing. And this guy sits in the middle here. So essentially what happens, if you can visualize this, and there's videos on this that are gonna be explaining this a lot better than me, but you have the back side of your pressure plate right here that sits on this throwout bearing. And then when you press the clutch pedal, you have the slave cylinder shaft that pushes this whole thing forward. And at that point, a whole bunch of magic happens, and even though I understand how it works, it's still sometimes hard to visualize. These prongs right here get pressed in, and they essentially help the clutch engage and disengage. I can't press them by hand, obviously it's not, I'm not that strong, but that's essentially how this whole thing works, is that the clutch plate by itself, moves in here, it gets engaged and disengaged through pressure, and it basically then feeds the power into the transmission. So I think that's enough about the front and like how all this works, because like I said, there are videos that explain this a lot better than I do, but I at least want to try to give you guys a general understanding of all the parts that are involved and what's happening with this manual setup. So let's move to the back and look at what's going on where the output of the power is. So then you have your transmission, which has a bunch of gears in it. And in order for those gears to be selected, you have a shifter linkage. So you got your selector rod, you got your actual shift lever right here. You can do a short shifter, you can do a standard shifter. And then you have this top, then you have this top shift carrier, I believe it's called. This is really messy, but I hope you guys are understanding the gist of what's going on. As you're shifting, it pushes this bottom rod back and forth, and it helps you select the gears. I can't manually pull this out for some reason. I don't know why, but I can't get it out. But this guy right here is what selects the gears inside. So you'll see it later in the car when everything's actually bolted in and we can get some proper leverage on there. So if that made any sense at all with the shift linkage, once you have your gear selected and the clutch is engaged, the power is gonna be fed through this back output flange into what's so-called guibo. This actually absorbs some of the torque during engagement to make it a little bit less harsh of an engagement. And then here we have our drive shaft. This is what essentially is going to be transferring the power from your transmission all the way to the back where the differential sits. On its way back, we have a center support bearing. This is what bolts to the bottom of the car to help the whole drive shaft stay aligned. And then as I said, it comes out the back and it's gonna be feeding the power to the differential and then out to your wheels. A couple very important components to talk about really quick. Right here, we have our slave cylinder. This actually bolts into the other side of the transmission if you wanna follow me over here, Matt. So this guy feeds in through here, right there. And then in the front, you can see again, our fork is gonna get pushed by the slave cylinder. You can see the little rod right here. This feeds over it, and this is what does the engagement and disengagement as I explained earlier. So, kind of a crazy process to think about, but there's a lot of parts involved. So this is where it gets a little bit tedious, and I'm not gonna go into every single component, but even things like, this is a little bracket that holds the clutch line onto the car. These are even little things that you're gonna need in order to convert your car. So really make sure before you start your swap that you at the very least feel confident that you have some 95% of all the components there in order to do the swap. We continue, we have a hard line that's gonna feed into the car, and it's gonna feed into the so-called master clutch cylinder or clutch master cylinder. And this is actually what's gonna take the input from your pedal, from your clutch pedal, it pushes the fluid, wow, I almost broke that. It pushes the fluid out through these lines all the way to the slave cylinder, and then that's where it does the pivoting action inside of the transmission. Other important components, obviously, transmission mounts. These are from Garagistic, these are solid mounts. So these are gonna cause a little bit of vibration when you're driving, which in return leads to more responsive clutch engagement and shifting, because the whole thing is not shifting around as much as with rubber mounts. We have our transmission brace. You need a manual one. The automatic one is different. So that's what's gonna mount the transmission to the body. You have your mounts that mount to this, and mount to the transmission mounts. Various other components related to installing all these bits and pieces. Make sure that stretch bolts are new. Make sure that, throw out and pilot bearing are new, because those are things that are so cheap that if you install all of this and then all of a sudden a couple months later your pilot bearing starts failing, you really don't want that. So for $6 or $7 or whatever the pilot bearing costs, it's well worth the investment. We have our soft clutch line. This is gonna be feeding the clutch master cylinder with brake fluid from the brake fluid reservoir. Those are actually the same, the reservoirs. You just snip off a little end. We'll show you that later. And that concludes the whole loop of this clutch hydraulic system. Two more things to show you, and then we're gonna get into wrenching. We got our clutch pedal assembly. Again, this is gonna be different between an early and a late model, but basically you have one extra pedal. You have your brake pedal, then you have your clutch pedal. There's definitely components related to that. You have return springs, you have sensors, clutch engagement sensors. Make sure you get the right stuff. I'm not gonna go into details about that, but that's another component that's important to cover. And then one more thing as a bonus that we're doing on this car, because we noticed that the rear main seal is leaking pretty heavily, is we went and picked up a new rear main seal setup. And we're just gonna be doing that because once again, this is so cheap. We don't wanna save money on this and then have to do the whole job again just because we're getting covered in oil because the rear main seal is leaking. So I'll show you how to do that as well. That's it. I think that's all in terms of parts. This is actually a reinforcement brace of the body as far as I know. It basically just bolts in on both the automatic and the manual transmission behind the trans brace. So just an extra part that you don't need to worry about because it's the same between the automatic and the manual transmissions as far as I know. So that's it. I hope that gives you kind of an understanding of what is all involved in this setup. It's a lot of parts. Like I said, they might vary, they might look different. So don't be too crazy about getting the exact same stuff. Definitely do your research. There's a parts list all over the internet that tell you what it takes to convert your car from automatic to manual. But again, just a general overview. Three hours into the process, and we're almost done jacking up the car. Game plan. First things first, we're gonna have to remove the exhaust. The exhaust is kind of in the way of everything we're trying to work on. Next, we're gonna remove the heat shields and get access to the drive shaft.
To undo the outer sensors, we're gonna unscrew it from here. It's basically a twist plastic connector. So we just do this. And then there's one plastic clip here, and that's pretty much it.
Yep. Okay. Coming where you're going? Ready? Look at this thing.
Well, yeah.
Oh my gosh. Wow.
Well, that's it. We'll go ahead and drive the car off, and we're good to go.
Okay, so as you can see, we have the drive shaft exposed. That's gonna be our next step, is to loosen all these bolts and nuts on both ends, so at the differential and at the automatic transmission output flange at the back. We're gonna loosen all of them. Definitely don't make the mistake of completely disconnecting one side and then working on the other side, because you're gonna be fighting basically a no resistance drive shaft. With everything bolted in, it's a lot easier to loosen everything, and then take out, because you can use the e-brake and the transmission at the front for, resistance. If you're doing this by yourself, for example, it's gonna be a lot easier. In order to remove these is to hold the nut on the one side with preferably a wrench, and then you're going to be able to use a socket on this side and crank away. Once you have one removed, you will have to go and put your car into neutral in order to be able to spin the drive shaft.
I wonder if it can go from here. Yeah, there you go.
Oh yeah, that's how broken that car is. Must have broken or something, I don't know.
Oh. What'd you do? I had a buyer lined up for this auto trans.
I'm not strong enough. That's why we have Matt on the
job, Matt.
team.
Good job,
That's
Matt.
right.
The next step is to unbolt the drive shaft from the differential. There are 4 bolts here. I'm just gonna loosen them up for now.
Yeah, and these are actually pressed in, so you're not gonna have to do the back like holding technique that I was doing up front. I don't know if you guys can see that on the camera or on the video, but it's just a nut, and then like I said, it's a pressed in stud from the drive shaft side.
Not this one. 1, 2. Rotate. Please don't fall on my face. There we go. And the drive shaft is out.
Next steps. We're gonna have to drain the transmission. There's a drain plug back there. And disconnect this tube right here. That's the dipstick tube for the transmission. Moving over, there are the various lines that run to the front, to the radiator, where the fluid runs through to get cooled. So we're gonna have to undo all those, drain all the fluid, and then take off the lines from the radiator. And at that point, we should be able to start taking out the transmission. But it's just easier to drain the fluid so we don't have all this fluid spilling out of the various lines as we're taking them off. So at this point, Matt is removing the remaining lines for all the transmission fluid, the cooling fluid, or fluid cooling. And right there, he's disconnecting the shift linkage mechanism. And then at that point, once all these lines are disconnected, I think we should be able to start working on disconnecting the actual transmission. All right, Matt, walk us through the process.
We got to the point where we released 2 of the hoses out of 3. We have 1 more left, but we do not have enough room to access it at the top. What we're gonna do is we're gonna loosen up the brace and drop the transmission slightly so it tilts back, and hopefully we're gonna have more access to that hose and we'll be able to disconnect it.
Excellent.
Loosened these up before. Now I'm just taking them off with the support of the jack. I do not like the angle of this. I'm just thinking. Okay, I'm gonna move the jack.
This is like a wildlife documentary. I'm just gonna let it happen. I'm not gonna interfere. I don't want nature to, you know,
Let me die here.
be intervened with, so I'm gonna let you figure this out. Dude, look at those transmission mounts are broken. They're not even attached. Look at that.
Oh wow.
They're literally just 2 pieces.
That's why it was not holding up.
Okay, I just want to take a moment to have another look at these transmission mounts. Wow. That is, dude, they look like these black mushrooms that you find like in the forest. Look at them. Look how cracked they are and how flattened these are. Almost at the end here of the transmission removal, we have the transmission flywheel. I think it's called a flywheel, I don't know. But it has these bolts right here that are holding the torque converter onto it. We removed this like access panel. At this point though, I think there's 3, maybe 4. We're gonna have to get them to the bottom here so we can actually access them. And then in order to do so, the engine slightly with a 22mm wrench to be able to get through those bolts. There we fresh gloves. We're gonna be working on the starter. And in order to work on the starter, we're gonna have to disconnect the battery because we don't wanna get zapped, nor do we wanna damage anything on the vehicle. So we're just gonna take the ground off, the negative terminal. And then now we can safely work with tools. Oh, hold on. Now we can safely work on the starter with tools. Starter.
There it is.
Excellent.
3 days later.
Yeah, that was a struggle and a half. Holy crap. So finally got the starter out. Can't really see anything here. And we have the big bolts that are at the top of the transmission off.
Correct.
And we look like we work in like a coal field or a coal mine or something.
Yep.
Like we're just completely covered. But at this point, we are going to be removing the last couple Torx bolts from the transmission, and I think at that point we're going to be able to slowly move it back.
That's right.
Have to be really careful with the torque converter because if that doesn't come out with the transmission, there's always the chance that it can leak a lot. It's leaking. Yep.
I don't think that's gonna help.
We're good. Let her down. So it really was just 3 bolts on the back. Just, I guess, I don't know, it just wouldn't slide off the way I thought it would. At this point, we got 8 flywheel bolts holding it on. Okay.
Yeah. I'm gonna draw my pants. I think I need a new pair. Next step, we're gonna remove this guy. To do that, we have to remove the trim to access all the brackets and screws. Once we do that, we should be able to remove the gear selector from the car. So these were broken, so we're removing these. There are a few nuts there. There's a connector that has to be unplugged. This guy.
And we got these connectors. No.
Weight reduction. 2. That's it.
No longer automatic. Cool thing about older cars like this is everything is pretty straightforward. As we said in the intro, the general gist applies to other cars as well, but obviously there could be, you know, differences in wiring, coding, just the overall setup. Not 100% guarantee every car is gonna have everything laid out to be automatic and manual. On an E30, really all you gotta do is just connect a couple wires right here, and then at that point, you already have your reverse light, you know, wiring done. Some cars require like an extra harness to be installed, but as you saw in this process, it's pretty straightforward, you know, to remove all these components because they're really not complicated. So, and the good thing is the installation is going to be even easier. Not as tiring as today was because it was that automatic transmission was a beast to get out. At this point, we're going to clean up and kind of
wait for the parts.
Let's transition into a little time lapse.
Day 1.
That was day 1, wrapped up. Quite a bit more work in terms of effort than we anticipated, but we achieved our goal. It's thundering outside, so time to call it a day.
Right.
So day 2 is going to be pedal assembly, and then reassembly of everything, because we're still waiting for parts. Rob's gonna get those this week. Anyways, if you guys enjoyed the video, make sure to subscribe to the channel, give it a thumbs up, and yeah, we will see you guys in part 2.